The late afternoon sun was dipping low behind the tall buildings, and the city streets were alive with the sound of shouting voices, honking horns, and police sirens. It was one of those days where the air felt heavy, not because of the weather, but because of the mood. People had gathered in large numbers to march, to speak, to hold signs high above their heads, each word written in bold letters demanding change. It was noisy, it was emotional, and it was tense. Detective Marcus Hayes, dressed not in uniform but in his dark suit and tie, was making his way across the crowded street. He had been stationed nearby, not as a protester, not even really as a standard police officer, but as an observer. His job that day was to monitor the crowd, make sure things did not get out of control, and to quietly take notes in case anything needed to be followed up later. Marcus had always been good at blending in, good at keeping calm when everything around him was loud and unsettled. But on that day, despite his calm walk, he felt something pressing down on him that was hard to explain. As he crossed near the center of the street, weaving through small groups of people, a voice suddenly cut through the noise, sharp, direct. "You there. Stop right now." Marcus turned his head and saw a young patrol officer breaking away from a cluster of police cars. The red and blue lights of the cruisers flashed wildly behind him, painting the scene in restless colors. The officer's hand was already near his holster, his face tight with suspicion. For a split second, Marcus wondered if the officer was shouting at someone else. Maybe a protester. Maybe a man further down the street. But then he realized the officer's eyes were locked onto him. The officer was staring directly at Marcus. "You match the description," the officer barked, stepping closer. "Get on the ground, now." The words hit Marcus like a blow. He stopped in his tracks, looking around quickly, as if trying to confirm that yes, it was him the officer was speaking to. A hush seemed to ripple through the crowd closest to them. People turned, phones lifted into the air, recording. Marcus raised his hand slightly, not in fear, but in confusion. "Excuse me?" he asked in a calm but surprised tone. The officer's voice grew louder. "On the ground! Hands where I can see them!" More officers turned to watch. The flashing lights behind them created a surreal stage, as if this single moment had become the center of the entire protest. People stopped chanting and began murmuring. The protest signs lowered slightly. The eyes of dozens, then hundreds, shifted toward Marcus. Marcus Hayes was a detective. He had been with the department for more than a decade. He had handled murder investigations, missing persons, gang violence, and everything in between. He had spent nights awake at his desk, working through files while his kids were at home asleep. He had chosen this path because he believed in justice, because he believed people needed someone to stand up for what was right. But right there in the middle of that crowded street, none of that seemed to matter. The patrol officer saw only a man who looked like a suspect. That was enough. Marcus slowly spread his hands wider, speaking carefully so his voice would not escalate the situation. "Officer, I think there's been a mistake. Down on the ground." The officer shouted again, his hand now gripping his holster tighter. The crowd gasped, their voices rising in protest. Some people shouted at the officer, others at Marcus, telling him not to resist, warning him not to move too suddenly. In an instant, what had been a protest about one issue became a protest about this very moment. Marcus felt the weight of the stares. He knew he could pull out his badge right away, end this confusion in seconds. He could hold it high, flash the gold shield that had always been his protection, his authority. But deep down, he also knew that something about this moment was bigger than him. If he showed the badge too soon, maybe no one would see the deeper problem. Maybe it would all be brushed off as a simple mistake. The officer stepped closer, his voice fierce. "Face down, hands out." Marcus slowly, deliberately lowered himself toward the ground. His suit brushed against the hot asphalt, his palms pressing against the rough surface. He could hear the crowd shouting louder now, their voices full of disbelief. Someone yelled, "He didn't do anything." Another shouted, "Why are you stopping him?" The noise swirled around him, a storm of anger and fear. Lying there, Marcus could feel his heart pounding, not out of fear for himself, but out of a heavy mix of frustration and sadness. This was not the first time he had been judged on appearance alone. This was not the first time he had felt the sting of bias. But what made it worse now was knowing that he carried a badge in his pocket. A badge that was supposed to mean respect, supposed to mean authority. Yet here he was, face pressed against the street, treated as if he were invisible. Another officer walked over, standing tall above Marcus. "What's the situation?" he asked the first officer. "Matches the suspect's description." "Got him right here," the younger one replied confidently. Marcus turned his head slightly to the side, his cheek against the ground. His voice was calm, steady. "Officer," he said slowly, "I'm not who you think I am." But the words seemed to fall into the noise, drowned out by sirens, by the shouting crowd, by the pounding of boots on pavement as more officers moved closer. In that strange silence inside his mind, Marcus thought of his family. He thought of his 2 children, who admired him, who told their friends proudly that their dad was a detective. He thought of the stories he had told them about courage, about standing tall in the face of wrong. He thought about the promise he had made to himself years ago, that he would never let the weight of injustice break him, no matter how heavy it became. Now on this crowded street, surrounded by people who were watching his every move, Marcus realized this moment was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been in his position. It was about showing his children that dignity could not be taken away, even when you were pressed against the ground. The seconds stretched into minutes. The crowd's chanting grew louder, the tension building with every passing breath. Marcus could feel the leather case of his badge pressing against his chest under his suit. It was there waiting. But not yet. Not until the world was forced to see what was really happening. The officer above him shifted, one hand hovering near his weapon, the other gripping his radio. The scene was locked in a fragile balance, one wrong move, one wrong word, and it could collapse into chaos. But Marcus stayed still, his calm presence almost defying the storm around him. He whispered to himself, barely audible, "Patience. The badge would come out soon." But first, the truth needed to be seen. And as the flashing lights reflected in the eyes of the growing crowd, Marcus Hayes lay on the ground, silent yet unbroken, the center of a moment that was about to change everything. The moment Detective Marcus Hayes was forced to the ground, the crowd that had been chanting and marching shifted its focus completely. Hundreds of eyes were drawn to the scene unfolding in the middle of the street. It was as if the protest had paused, the voices that had been crying out for justice now pointing toward this single act of injustice happening in real time. The people had come to raise their voices against unfair treatment, and now they were staring at it, playing out only a few feet from where they stood. Phones were lifted high into the air, glowing screens capturing every detail. Some hands shook with anger as their owners recorded. Others trembled with fear of what might happen next. A woman in the front row of the crowd shouted, "He didn't do anything." "Leave him alone," her voice cracked, carrying the raw emotion of someone who had seen too many moments like this before. Marcus could feel the heat of the pavement under his cheek, the uncomfortable press of his suit jacket digging into his shoulders. But more than that, he could feel the eyes of the people on him. He heard snippets of their voices, pleading, demanding, accusing. "Why are you stopping him?" shouted a man nearby. Another voice rang out. "This is exactly why we're here today." The tension in the air thickened, turning every second into something that felt like it could snap without warning. The officer who had ordered Marcus down kept his posture stiff, his hand hovering near his holster. But the sound of the crowd was starting to break through his authority. He glanced around, noticing the sea of phones pointed at him, the growing volume of voices calling him out. His jaw clenched, but he did not back down. He wanted to show control, yet the moment was slipping from his grasp. Marcus, lying there, remained calm. His years of experience had taught him that anger in these moments could be dangerous. He breathed slowly, his chest rising and falling against the unforgiving ground. He did not resist, but he did not surrender his dignity either. His silence, his composure seemed to challenge the situation more than if he had shouted. He was a detective, a man who had spent his life studying human behavior, and he knew that sometimes the quiet presence of restraint was louder than any protest. The crowd seemed to sense it too. Their shouts grew more coordinated, more united. It was no longer scattered voices, but a chorus demanding the officers to stop, urging them to look closer, to think about what they were doing. Some chanted, "Let him up. Let him up," over and over, their rhythm filling the street like a drumbeat. Others shouted personal pleas. "That man is not resisting." "You're making a mistake. Check who he is." A line of officers in the background exchanged nervous looks. They were there to control the protest, but now they were faced with a scene that was turning the protest into something bigger. The people were no longer shouting at the system in general. They were shouting at them directly, pointing to Marcus as living proof of the very issue they were protesting. It was uncomfortable. It was undeniable. Marcus's mind raced quietly as he lay there. He thought about how quickly perception shaped reality. One moment he had been just another man walking across the street. The next he was a suspect in the eyes of a stranger with authority. He thought about how his badge, still tucked safely inside his jacket, could change the entire scene in an instant. But he also thought about how unfair it was that he needed that badge to be seen differently. He knew that the crowd watching him was not just recording his body on the ground. They were recording a truth, one that could not be silenced when replayed over and over on screens across the world. The woman who had shouted earlier began crying, her tears streaming as she continued to hold up her phone. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded through sobs. The sound carried through the tense silence between chants, reaching even Marcus's ears. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat but in empathy. He understood her pain because he had lived with the same questions. The officer knelt slightly closer to Marcus, his voice a low growl meant only for him. "You'd better stay still. Don't make me do something you'll regret." Marcus slowly turned his head just enough to make eye contact, his calm eyes locking onto the officer's tense ones. His voice was even, almost steady enough to mask the sting he felt inside. "I am staying still. You should listen to them." He nodded slightly toward the crowd. The officer swallowed hard, glancing at the people screaming around him. For a split second, doubt flickered in his expression. He had control of one man, on the ground, but the weight of hundreds of witnesses pressed against him, heavy and unrelenting. Meanwhile, Marcus thought of his children again. He imagined them one day seeing the videos that were surely being recorded right now. He did not want them to see him as helpless, nor did he want them to see bitterness. He wanted them to understand that dignity could survive even when others tried to strip it away. He wanted them to learn that courage was not always about fighting back, but sometimes about enduring with patience until the truth revealed itself. The chants grew louder, echoing off the tall buildings. "Let him up! Let him up!" The rhythm was impossible to ignore now. Even the officers standing behind the first one began to shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting from Marcus to the crowd. Some of them whispered to one another, questioning, doubting, unsure if the man lying on the street was really who they thought he was. One young man in the crowd raised his voice above the rest. "You think he's a suspect because of how he looks? Look closer. Look at him." His words cut through the air, silencing the chants for a moment. Dozens of eyes followed his direction, staring at Marcus with new focus. The man's words had given voice to what everyone was already thinking. This was not about guilt. This was about bias. Marcus remained still, breathing slowly, his hands outstretched on the rough pavement. He did not need to say anything more in that moment, because the crowd was speaking for him. They had become his voice, amplifying the injustice that was unfolding. In that tense pause, it felt like the entire city was holding its breath. The flashing lights, the sirens, the chants, all of it became the backdrop to a single, powerful truth. The people were watching. And for once they were not silent. Marcus knew that this was only the beginning of the moment. He could sense that the time to reveal his badge was approaching, but he also knew that what had already been seen and felt would never be forgotten. The crowd had borne witness. They had turned their eyes, their cameras, and their voices into a mirror, forcing everyone, especially the officers, to see the uncomfortable reflection staring back at them. And so he stayed there, grounded but not broken, surrounded by the voices of strangers who had in that moment become his defenders. Lying on the pavement with the weight of suspicion pressing down harder than the officer's hand, Marcus Hayes felt time slow in a way that only happens in life's most defining moments. Around him, the world was still moving, sirens wailing, people shouting, phones recording. But inside his own mind, there was a quiet space where his thoughts and doubts battled against each other. That inner silence was louder than the chaos outside. He thought first of his training, the countless times he had been told that the badge was a shield, that once you earned it, It stood as proof of your honor, your dedication, and your service. He remembered sitting in the academy classroom years ago, the instructor's stern voice telling the cadets, "When you wear this badge, people will know who you are. They will know you are here to protect them." But as he lay with his cheek pressed against the asphalt, Marcus wondered if that promise had ever truly been real. Right now, no one cared that he was Detective Hayes. No one cared about the cases he had solved, the families he had helped, or the years of his life he had given to the job. To the officer holding him down, he was just a suspect who matched a description. The weight of that truth sank into him, and yet deeper still, another thought rose, a question he had asked himself many times before, but never with such urgency. Why did he need the badge to prove his humanity? Why did he need a symbol of authority for people to believe he was more than just an assumption? That was the struggle tearing at him inside. He could end this right now. He could reach into his jacket, pull out his badge, hold it up, and watch as the officer's face fell and the crowd erupted in outrage. It would be over. The humiliation would stop. But Marcus hesitated because he knew something larger was at stake. If he showed his badge too soon, the world might never see the real issue. They might say it was just a misunderstanding, just a mix-up that got corrected. They would miss the deeper truth, that he had been judged and brought down not because of what he did, but because of who he was. His mind traveled back to his childhood. He remembered being 10 years old, walking home from school with his older brother when a neighborhood officer stopped them for no reason at all. The fear in his brother's eyes that day had never left Marcus. His mother's warning words echoed, "You have to be careful. Some people will not see you for who you are, only what they expect you to be." That memory weighed heavy now, merging with the reality of his present. He had lived through the bias as a boy, and now as a detective he was reliving it again, only this time with a badge in his pocket. The crowd's voices grew louder around him, yet Marcus stayed quiet. Inside he was wrestling with what choice to make. One side of him wanted to protect his dignity immediately, to rise up and silence the humiliation by flashing the shield that no one could deny. But another side urged patience. Wait. Let them see. Let them understand. If he rushed, the truth would be hidden. If he waited, the truth would be undeniable. He thought about his children again. His daughter had once asked him if being a detective meant he was a hero. He had smiled and said, "It means I try to be." What would she think if she saw him now? Would she see him as a man powerless on the ground, or would she see him as someone strong enough to face injustice with calm? He wanted her to understand that being a hero was not about how you looked when you stood tall, but about how you carried yourself when you were forced down. The officer shifted beside him, restless under the growing pressure of the crowd's chants. Marcus could sense the tension building in the man's body, the quickening of his breath, the uncertainty in his grip. The officer was not used to this, being challenged not by resistance but by silence and composure. Marcus almost pitied him, a young man taught to see control as power, not realizing that true power often lay in restraint. Inside, Marcus's thoughts took on the rhythm of the crowd's chants, a drumbeat of truth repeating itself. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than me. This is bigger than me. He reminded himself that he had survived much worse, cases where lives hung by a thread, nights spent searching for missing children, days spent comforting grieving parents. This moment was another test, but it was different. This test was not about solving a case, it was about proving a truth. The struggle was not only about whether to reveal his badge, it was about what the badge even meant anymore. Was it truly a shield of honor, or was it just a piece of metal? That only worked when people decided it mattered. And what did it say about the world if a man had to hold up a badge to be seen as innocent? Marcus's breath slowed as he let the questions settle inside him. He could feel the hard leather of his badge case pressing against his chest, as if reminding him it was still there, still waiting. But he kept his hands stretched out on the pavement, refusing to reach for it just yet. He wanted the officer to see him not as a detective, not as a title, but as a human being who deserved dignity regardless of any badge. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The voices around him kept rising, the crowd growing bolder, their chants echoing off the buildings, their outrage undeniable. And still Marcus lay there, steady and patient, fighting his inner battle, with the quiet strength of a man who knew the importance of timing. His inner struggle was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of wisdom. He understood that life sometimes placed you in moments where the choice you made could ripple far beyond yourself. This was one of those moments. If he chose wrong, the ripples would fade. If he chose right, the ripples could turn into waves that carried truth across the city, across the nation. So he waited, his mind calm despite the storm around him. He would rise when the time was right. He would reveal the badge when it could speak not just for him, but for everyone who had been unseen, unheard, and underestimated. And as he lay there, Marcus Hayes realized that the hardest battles were not fought with fists or weapons, but inside the heart, where patience and courage had to overcome fear and pride. The chants of the crowd were rising like a storm that no one could silence. Every voice seemed to be demanding the same thing, urging the officers to see what they had done, calling out the injustice that was playing out in front of so many witnesses. The street, once filled with the rhythm of marching feet and protest signs, was now centered on one man lying on the ground. The weight of all those eyes pressed down as firmly as the officer's hand on Marcus Hayes' shoulder. For long minutes Marcus had stayed still, his hands stretched out, his breath calm, his mind steady despite the chaos around him. But he knew the moment had come. He could feel it in the air, in the way the chants had shifted from confusion to clarity, in the way the officer's grip was starting to waver under the pressure of the crowd. Marcus realized that if he waited any longer, the moment might slip away. It was time to act, not with anger, not with rage, but with the quiet strength that spoke louder than any shouted word. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus moved one hand. The crowd gasped, some shouting warnings, others pleading with the officers not to overreact. The officer above him stiffened instantly, his voice sharp and panicked. "Keep your hands where I can see them." But Marcus did not rush. Every motion was calm, steady, almost rehearsed. He turned his wrist just enough to slide his fingers toward the inside of his jacket. The world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd grew silent for the first time since the confrontation began. Even the wailing sirens seemed distant, muffled against the sound of anticipation that hung in the air. People leaned forward, their phones capturing every angle. The officers around Marcus shifted nervously, their eyes darting between his hand and the restless faces of the people recording. Then, with a smooth motion, Marcus pulled the leather case from his jacket. His fingers curled around it, and for a moment it looked like nothing more than a dark wallet. But when he lifted it into the air and snapped it open, the gold gleam of his badge caught the flashing red and blue lights. The silence that followed was deafening. Dozens of officers froze where they stood. The crowd's shouts turned into a collective gasp, then into murmurs that rippled across the street. The badge reflected in the eyes of everyone watching, undeniable and unshakable. The words engraved beneath the shield, "Detective Marcus Hayes," were proof that could not be ignored. The young patrol officer's face drained of color. His confident stance crumbled, replaced by a flicker of disbelief and fear. He stepped back slightly, his hand slipping away from his holster. His mouth opened as if to say something, but no words came out. He looked from the badge to Marcus's calm face, then back again, as if trying to reconcile the man on the ground with the authority that badge represented. Marcus rose slowly, not with anger, but with dignity. He pushed himself up from the ground, brushing the dust from his suit, the badge still held high above his head for all to see. His calmness carried more weight than any outburst could have. The crowd erupted, not in chants this time, but in cries of disbelief, in claps, in voices shouting, "He's a detective! He's one of them!" The officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Marcus and the crowd. They knew they had been exposed, not just in a mistake, but in something larger, something that cut deeper. The badge had not only proven Marcus's identity, it had revealed the truth of the bias that had led him to the ground in the first place. Marcus did not lower the badge right away. He held it high, letting it shine in the flashing lights, letting every camera capture its reflection. He wanted the world to see, not just that he was a detective, but that even with that authority, he had been reduced to the ground before anyone thought to ask who he was. He wanted the silence that fell in that moment to echo louder than the sirens, to settle in the minds of everyone watching. The young officer stammered finally, his voice shaky. I didn't know. I thought you matched the suspect's description." His words sounded hollow, falling flat against the reality of what had just happened. The crowd did not accept the excuse. Their voices rose again, this time angrier, sharper. "That's not good enough," someone shouted. "You didn't even check," cried another. Marcus lowered the badge slightly, holding it now at his chest. His voice, calm but firm, carried across the street. "You saw what you wanted to see," he said, his eyes locked on the officer. "You didn't ask questions. You didn't give me a chance. You saw me and you assumed." The words cut through the night like a blade. The officer flinched but said nothing more. The other officers behind him shifted uneasily, some lowering their eyes, others glancing toward the crowd as if hoping the people would turn their attention elsewhere. But the crowd would not look away. They had seen the truth, and there was no undoing it. Marcus turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces watching him. He could see the mix of emotions, anger, relief, sadness, and a deep weariness that came from having witnessed too many moments like this before. He held their gaze, letting them see that he was not broken, that he was still standing with dignity despite what had happened. The badge in his hand was no longer just a symbol of authority. In that moment, it had become a mirror, reflecting the flaws of a system that allowed a man to be judged before being known. The silence that had fallen over the officers was not just about realizing their mistake. It was about facing the uncomfortable truth that their actions had been guided by bias, not justice. Marcus finally slipped the badge back into his jacket, but the image of it held high and the flashing lights lingered in the minds of everyone who had seen it. The crowd erupted into cheers and clapping, their voices filling the night. Some shouted his name after hearing it. Others simply cried out words of support. In that moment, Marcus was not just a detective, he was a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, of the truth that could not be hidden. And as the chants and cheers echoed through the street, the young officer who had stopped him stood frozen, his silence louder than any apology he could have given. Marcus had revealed his badge, but more importantly, he had revealed something far greater. He had shown the world that justice could not depend on assumptions, and dignity could not depend on a badge alone. The silence after Marcus raised his badge lingered like a heavy fog over the street. For a long moment no one spoke, no one moved, and even the restless hum of sirens felt distant. The young patrol officer who had ordered Marcus to the ground stood frozen, his hand still twitching near his holster, though he no longer had the will to draw. His authority, which moments earlier had filled the air, now seemed to shrink in the shadow of the gold badge gleaming under the flashing lights. Marcus stood tall, brushing the dust from his suit, his eyes calm but steady. He was not angry in his movements, nor was he triumphant. He was deliberate, composed, the quiet dignity of a man who knew that in moments like this, silence could wound deeper than shouting. Every camera phone recording him captured not just his badge but his poise. He was showing the world that despite being forced to the ground, his dignity had never been taken. The crowd, however, did not stay silent. They erupted into noise again, but this time it was not fear or outrage. It was disbelief mixed with a powerful sense of validation. Dozens of voices rose all at once. "He's a detective. You stopped one of your own. How could you not know?" The chants turned into laughter in some places, into scornful shouts in others. The officers standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, no longer looking like protectors of order, but like men who had been caught in a mistake too large to defend. The power in the street had shifted completely. Marcus did not need to raise his voice. He simply looked at the young officer, his eyes piercing but calm. The man stammered, trying to find words, but the weight of the crowd's reaction crushed whatever excuse he had been forming. Marcus's silence spoke louder than anything else. The authority was no longer in the officer's holster or his raised voice. It was in Marcus's steady presence, in the gleam of the badge, and in the eyes of the people who had witnessed everything. One older woman in the front of the crowd began clapping slowly, her palms echoing like a drumbeat against the night air. Others joined her, their applause rising into cheers. It was not celebration of Marcus's badge alone, but of the truth revealed in that moment. The crowd was cheering because the system had been exposed, because a man who represented justice had been treated unjustly, and because, for once, it was undeniable. The evidence was standing right in front of them. The young officer finally lowered his eyes, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his mistake. He muttered something, but it was lost in the noise. Marcus took a slow step toward him, not aggressively, not even with anger, but with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the power of presence. Standing just a few feet away, Marcus said in a low voice, calm but firm enough for those nearby to hear, "Authority is not about who you can bring down. It's about who you lift up." The officer swallowed hard, his lips pressed tightly as though holding back a flood of excuses. But Marcus had already turned away, his words hanging in the air like an unshakable truth. The other officers, who had been silent until now, shifted nervously under the gaze of the crowd. Their uniforms no longer commanded respect in that moment. They looked at Marcus not as someone they had authority over, but as someone whose presence had eclipsed their own. One of them, older and clearly more experienced, stepped forward as if to offer a quiet apology, but he stopped himself. There were no words that could erase what had been done. Marcus did not seek their apology anyway. His concern was not for their comfort, but for the message being carried to the hundreds of eyes and cameras still fixed on him. He wanted the people to see strength without anger, dignity without violence, truth without compromise. That was how power truly shifted, not through force, but through the undeniable weight of integrity. The chants began again, this time sharper, directed squarely at the officers. "Do better," shouted one voice. "Check before you judge," cried another. The crowd was no longer divided between protesters and bystanders. They were united, their voices carrying the lesson Marcus had silently demanded. The shift in power was not only between him and the officer, but between the people and the system. In that moment, the people realized their voices had power too. Marcus stood at the center, letting the noise swell around him, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. He knew this was not just about him anymore. The badge had revealed the truth, but it was the crowd that had turned the truth into a message that could not be silenced. The power now belonged to everyone who had witnessed what happened. The young officer stepped back further, his face pale, his authority stripped away not by Marcus's words alone, but by the sheer weight of accountability pressing down on him. He looked smaller now, not because of his size, but because of the truth that had been forced upon him. Marcus took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he looked out at the faces in the crowd. He saw people who had come with signs, with slogans, with anger in their hearts, now staring at him as though he had become the living symbol of what they had been trying to say all along. He had not asked for this role, but it had found him, and he understood that sometimes life chose its messengers in the most unexpected ways. For years he had carried the weight of the badge, believing it meant protection, believing it meant authority. But standing there now, he realized that real authority was not in the metal shield he carried, but in the truth he embodied. The shift in power was not about one man rising above another. It was about exposing the reality that dignity and humanity were not privileges to be granted by authority, but rights that belonged to everyone. The crowd roared again, this time not in anger, but in support. Their cheers filled the night, echoing down the streets carried on the recording devices that would soon spread the scene far beyond that block. The officers who had once stood tall now looked down at the ground, their silence admitting what they could not say. Marcus turned once more, his face calm, his voice steady as he said, "Respect should never depend on a badge. It should depend on humanity." His words were caught by dozens of phones carried instantly to the ears of those who would watch the videos later. The crowd cheered louder, their applause shaking the night, and in that moment the power shifted completely. Marcus Hayes, the man who had been brought down for matching a suspect, now stood taller than ever before, not because of his badge, but because of his unbroken dignity. The night air carried the weight of silence after Marcus's final words hung in the street. For a long moment the cheers and chants of the crowd faded into an almost reverent hush, as though everyone present knew they had just witnessed something greater than a misunderstanding between a cop and a man. They had seen a truth revealed, one that could not be denied, one that demanded to be spoken out loud. Marcus stood there, his badge no longer raised but his presence still towering. The young officer who had brought him down avoided his eyes, staring instead at the pavement as though hoping it would swallow him whole. Around them, the line of officers shifted uneasily, their once stiff postures bending under the crushing weight of public shame. The power that had defined the moment earlier had vanished, replaced now by a lesson that none of them could escape. Marcus turned slowly, looking not at the officers but at the crowd. He saw faces lit by the glow of phone screens, eyes wide with anger and hope, lips pressed tight with unspoken stories of their own. He saw parents holding their children's hands tighter, young men recording every word, older women wiping tears from their cheeks. And he realized that the lesson was not only for the officers, it was for everyone. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but steady, a voice built from years of carrying truth inside his chest. "A badge should not be the only thing that protects me," he said, his words echoing into the restless night. "My life, your life, every life should matter before any badge is seen." The crowd roared, their voices colliding in agreement, in pain, in relief that someone had put into words what they had been trying to scream for years. It was not just applause. It was an outpouring, a release of emotion too heavy to hold inside. Marcus let their voices wash over him. He did not smile. He did not raise his hands. He stood steady, knowing this moment was not about glory but about truth. He was not speaking for himself alone. He was speaking for every person who had ever been forced to the ground, for every family who had ever carried the weight of injustice, for every child who had ever asked why they were treated differently. The young officer's lips trembled, his throat tightening as though he wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but Marcus did not look at him again. The lesson was not in an apology. It was in the silence that followed the exposure of truth. The silence was heavier, more honest than any excuse could have been. The older officer who had stepped forward earlier finally lowered his gaze, his hands resting awkwardly on his belt. He had been in the job long enough to know what this moment meant. The system he represented had been unmasked in front of hundreds of people, and there was nothing he could do to cover it back up. The only thing left was to listen. Marcus stepped closer to the crowd now, his voice still calm but carrying strength. "This is not about me," he said. "This is about all of us, about the way we see each other, the way we treat each other. I should not need to prove my worth with a badge. None of us should need permission to be seen as human." A murmur spread through the crowd, voices whispering to one another, repeating his words like a mantra. Phones zoomed closer, recording every syllable. Somewhere, someone began to cry softly, their sobs carried into the night as a reminder of how deep this truth ran. Marcus's eyes swept across the people, and he softened his voice slightly. "I am a detective. I have spent my life fighting for justice. But tonight I was not seen as a detective. I was not seen as a man who has served this city. I was seen as a suspect because of how I look. And if it can happen to me with this badge in my pocket, then what does that mean for everyone else who does not carry one?" The weight of his question pressed into the hearts of everyone listening. It was not rhetorical. It was real, urgent, and undeniable. Parents nodded in grim agreement. Young men clenched their fists in silent solidarity. Women shook their heads, tears glistening in their eyes. The truth was a wound, and Marcus had pressed his finger against it for everyone to feel. He paused, letting the silence answer before continuing. "We have to do better, all of us. We have to look beyond uniforms, beyond descriptions, beyond assumptions. We have to see each other for who we are, not for what fear tells us to see. Respect should not come after a badge is shown. It should come before, because respect is the foundation of humanity." The crowd erupted again, their chants shifting now from anger to determination. "Do better," they shouted in rhythm. "Do better." The chant grew louder and louder until it filled the street like thunder, rolling through the city blocks, impossible to ignore. The officers standing in line shifted uncomfortably again, but this time they did not try to silence the people. They knew they could not. Marcus stepped back slightly, letting the chant rise without interruption. He knew the message had been delivered, not because he had spoken it, but because the people had carried it, repeated it, turned it into something larger than one man. That was the true lesson. That change did not come from a badge or a single voice, but from the unity of many voices demanding the same truth. When the chant finally began to fade, Marcus looked once more at the young officer who had stopped him. He did not speak to him directly. He simply held his gaze for a brief moment, his calm eyes saying what words could not. "You have seen now. Do not forget." The officer looked away, his shame heavy, his silence loud. Marcus turned back to the crowd and nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude and solidarity. The people responded with cheers, applause, and shouts of his name. He did not bask in it. He simply acknowledged it. Knowing the lesson was no longer his alone, it belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And as the night stretched on, the protest did not return to its old rhythm. It had been transformed. The signs still waved, the chants still rang, but now they carried a sharper edge, a clearer purpose. The story of Marcus Hayes would spread far beyond that street, carried by videos, by whispers, by headlines that would echo in homes and schools and conversations across the nation. The lesson had been delivered, not by force, not by anger, but by the quiet strength of a man who refused to let his dignity be stripped away, and by the voices of people who refused to stay silent when they saw the truth. And in that lesson, a new kind of power was born. Long after the flashing lights faded and the crowd began to disperse, the memory of what had happened on that street refused to leave. For the people who had stood there, for those who had recorded it on their phones, and for those who had shouted until their voices cracked, it became a story too heavy to ignore. And for Marcus Hayes, the man at the center of it all, it became the kind of moment that shaped a legacy. That night, the videos spread quickly. Within hours, they were shared across social media, replayed thousands of times, dissected in comments, debated in homes, and carried onto television screens. The image of a black detective forced to the ground, only to rise with his badge shining under the city lights, was unforgettable. The silence that followed his reveal was captured perfectly on video, a silence that carried the weight of centuries of unspoken truths. People who had not been there in person now saw it with their own eyes, and the reaction was the same everywhere: disbelief, outrage, and then reflection. Marcus himself returned home that night to his family. His children, who had been too young to understand all the complexities of bias, listened as their father sat them down and explained what had happened. He did not tell them with bitterness. He did not fill their ears with anger. Instead, he spoke with the same calm strength he had shown on the street. He told them the truth, that sometimes people see only what they want to see, that sometimes dignity is tested in unfair ways, and that sometimes the strongest response is not to fight back, but to stand firm until the truth speaks louder than lies. His daughter looked at him with wide eyes and said softly, "You didn't let them take your strength." Those words stayed with Marcus more than any headline ever could. The department, meanwhile, could not escape the attention. Questions poured in from the public, from journalists, from city leaders. How could a decorated detective be treated like a suspect by his own colleagues? How could the very people who worked beside him fail to see him? The officers involved were placed under scrutiny, and though the official statements called it a misunderstanding, the people knew it was more than that. It was a reflection of something deeper, something systemic. And now, thanks to the videos and the voices of the crowd, it could not be hidden under polite excuses. For Marcus, the days that followed were both exhausting and transformative. Reporters wanted interviews. Community leaders wanted him to speak at gatherings. Students invited him to schools to share his story. Each time, Marcus carried the same message he had spoken on the street. Respect should not depend on a badge, it should depend on humanity. He never allowed the attention to make him arrogant, never let the spotlight distract him from the truth. He spoke not as a hero, but as a man who had been forced to the ground and had chosen to rise with dignity. The legacy of that moment was not in the humiliation he endured, but in the lesson it delivered. People began to talk differently about assumptions, about quick judgments, about the silent biases that lived under the surface. Conversations that once happened quietly in corners were now being spoken aloud in classrooms, in workplaces, in homes. Parents showed the video to their children, explaining the importance of respect. Teachers played it to spark discussions about fairness and justice. Community leaders used it to call for reforms. Marcus understood that his story was no longer his alone. It belonged to the people who had seen it, shared it, and carried it into their own lives. And that was the true legacy. Not a single man rising from the pavement, but an entire community rising with him. Yet Marcus remained deeply human through it all. There were nights when the memory of being forced to the ground weighed heavily on him. He replayed the moment in his mind, not with regret, but with the ache of knowing how fragile dignity could be in the face of bias. He thought of how quickly things could have gone differently, how one wrong move could have changed the outcome forever. He carried that awareness with him not as fear but as resolve. He continued his work as a detective, walking the same streets, solving the same cases, serving the same city. But everywhere he went, people recognized him now. They nodded in respect. Some whispered his name. Others stopped to thank him for what he had stood for. He accepted their gratitude humbly, reminding them that the story was not about him but about all of them. About every person who deserved to be seen fully before being judged. The officer who had stopped him that night eventually left the force, unable to carry the weight of his mistake. Marcus never spoke ill of him publicly. When asked about it, he simply said, "Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that break us open. I hope he learns from it." His refusal to respond with bitterness was part of what made his story resonate so deeply. He showed the world that strength was not measured in retaliation, but in restraint. Not in anger, but in clarity. Years later, when people spoke of that protest, they remembered many things. The signs, the chants, the sea of voices, but above all, they remembered the man who was forced down and then rose again, holding up his badge not as a weapon of authority, but as a mirror that reflected the truth back at everyone watching. His story became a teaching moment, a reminder that justice cannot exist without humanity, and humanity cannot be judged by appearance. For his children, his legacy was even more personal. They grew up with the memory of that night shaping their understanding of the world. They carried their father's words with them, repeating them in their own lives, teaching others that respect must always come before authority. In their eyes, Marcus was more than a detective. He was proof that dignity could survive even the harshest trials. And for Marcus himself, the legacy was simple. He had not asked for that moment, but he had lived it with honesty, and he had let it teach others what they needed to see. He had shown that the truest kind of strength does not come from shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest. It comes from standing firm in your humanity, even when the world tries to deny it. As the years passed, the story was retold countless times, shared in classrooms, whispered in church halls, replayed on anniversaries of that protest. Each retelling carried the same image: a man rising from the pavement, lifting a badge into the air, and in doing so, lifting the dignity of everyone who had ever felt unseen. That was the legacy of Marcus Hayes. A detective, yes, but more than that, a reminder that respect is not earned by titles or shields. It is owed to every human being simply because they are human. And though the night itself ended, its echo never did. It lived on in the voices of those who carried the lesson forward, in the hearts of those who refused to forget, and in the unshakable truth that silence can fall, but dignity will always rise.